So, hi everyone. Is it working?
No, it is working. It's just need to. There you go.
Okay, cool. It's okay. Cool. So, hi, my name is Angelica. I'm the Vice President of Polygeia Cambridge, but also the Vice President of Trinity AMR Action Group 2. And I just wanted to talk a bit more about the project that I've been working on that was commissioned by Dame Sally Davies. And we've been investigating AMR policy and adherence in food industry conglomerates and investor groups to recommend appropriate policy adjustments in order to promote the responsible usage of antimicrobials. So I guess the first question that you might want to ask is like, why are we focusing on food industry conglomerates? And the answer is that most of the burden in terms of AMR is focused on these agricultural groups. So I'm sure the speakers before have already highlighted kind of the human and economic burden of AMR, but I will reiterate that again. So in 2019, 1.27 million deaths were directly attributed to bacterial AMR and 5 million were more generally associated with AMR. And AMR-associated deaths are predicted to double to 10 million by 2050. And in terms of the economic cost, the cumulative economic cost predicts an annual loss of $1 trillion after 2030, which will then increase to $2 trillion by 2050. So that's clearly a massive economic cost. And in terms of antimicrobial usage in the sector, 80% of all antibiotics have been given to animals, mostly for prophylactic usage. So that's just to prevent bacterial infections or as growth promoting agents. So there has been progress on preventing this in terms of the 2022 ban on prophylactic usage of antimicrobials in the EU and in the UK. However, countries like the US, Brazil, and China, which will use the majority of antimicrobials, haven't got any legislation like this. So that's a clear problem. And I think this slide just really exemplifies the externalities that will result from the unethical practice or usage of antimicrobials have a direct impact on both human and animal health. And this therefore demonstrates the high yield nature of focusing on the area of the food industry and investment into the food industry. So I just wanted to outline the project goals that we have. And our main goal is kind of to investigate published AMR policies and adherence of food industry conglomerates. So these are producers, so that's like the farms, retailers and restaurant chains and their greatest investors. So those will tend to be things like pension funds or banks. And the way we've done this is through a combined approach. So this is through looking at the primary research. So that's through like conducting questionnaires, semi-structured interviews with corporate representatives, but also through secondary research. So that's through literature reviews to try to identify gaps in policy. And one of our final goals is trying to ensure the further objectivity of further AMR policy research, because to be honest with you, this is an area where there hasn't been much work. But we'd like to introduce a set of standards to ensure that investors compare their prospective investees with our standards that we'll create, but also it will help inform producer groups and retailer groups and restaurant groups too. And yeah, the last point just reiterates exactly what I've said. And hopefully through doing this, we can identify and hopefully surmount key barriers that prevent companies from adopting such AMR practices and publishing their own AMR policies. So this is the kind of the project timeline we have currently. We estimate to be finished around mid-February. And I thought I'd better just split the project up into sections, so it's better known like what we're actually doing, and also highlighting our current findings at the end. So first of all, if we focus on our literature search that we've been doing currently, so the focus is on grey literature and policy documents which are available, but obviously something to be noted here is the fact that not all policy documents are going to be publicly available, and the companies that tend to be more stringent in terms of their antimicrobial usage are going to be more likely to publish their policies because that will give them positive press as well. And that obviously contributes towards like publication bias. And this literature search would be like, we have actually completed this at all levels of the future. And so that's again, in the producers, retailers, and restaurant chains. So if you come on to the primary research that we hope to do now, as the questionnaires and the semi-structured interviews, our key goal is to actually understand current AMR policy and perhaps inquire information that wasn't publicly disclosed if possible because of the barriers I mentioned before, and to see to which extent they've actually achieved the goals they've set out to do, and if they've not achieved their goals, what they actually plan to do in the future. And in this stage, it's really important to identify the key barriers to responsible antimicrobial usage. So our ideal situation is to actually, following sending out the questionnaires to all these groups, is to have semi-structured interviews and conversations with the corporate representatives who will obviously know their policy best. So we can discuss the barriers to implementing their policy, but also their future steps of the company in general. And we have multiple incentives for engagement because obviously there's not really any monetary gain from conversations which we have, so we wanted to try to ensure that as many people will engage with us as possible, and hopefully a gold standard for company policy can be collated from a case study series of outstanding actions for different companies. And in terms of actually suggesting policy improvements, we hope to suggest improvements based on the discrepancies between the existing policies and the actions of the companies. And it's actually, I've mentioned this multiple times before, but it's really important to focus on the key barriers to achieving the desired policy goal versus what the company is actually able to achieve. Because I think in terms of like AMR, it's very easy to be very idealistic and hope that everybody can reduce their antimicrobial usage down to the absolute essential, but in the real world, that doesn't really work. So it's a balance between actually reducing antimicrobial usage to just essential use, but also balancing what's actually economically feasible in the long term. And we were thinking of doing a cost benefit analysis in order to kind of consider both of these aspects. And the goals of the company and must also be really considered when adjusting the policy, which is where contact with the company representative is useful, because they obviously know what's best for the company, what the company wants to do in the future, because we want to make sure these improvements are in line with the company ethos in general. So if we look at the role of investors in AMR policy now, so key investor groups are things like banks, private equity firms, pension funds, and large institutional investors, and Trinity could be considered as one of them too. And some key investors have already signed up to FAIR. So FAIR is a company who provides investor partners with a framework called the Protein Producer Index. So they're primarily focused at looking at AMR or antimicrobial usage in the agricultural sector. And it includes AMR as one of the top 10 criteria, which they will critique a company's policy. And we've kind of already looked at FAIR's report, and it has kind of supported us in our initial stages of secondary research on our literature review. So if we look at the investor approaches surrounding AMR, so our focus was actually looking at published investment policy standards. I feel for investor groups, it's a lot harder to actually ascertain how they interact with AMR in general, because it's not as easy as looking at a farm and understanding how much antimicrobials they actually use. But at the initial stage of the literature review, we'd identified a pretty big problem, because the UK government actually published an AMR review in 2016 in terms of just giving guidance to investors. But it hasn't yet been converted into a format that allows investors to clearly understand how they can act on the impending threat of AMR. Because I feel that like there's a lot of literature kind of exemplifying how important AMR is to consider, but if they don't know how to actually utilize that in their decision making, that is a bit redundant. So we hope to address that too. So if we look at the questionnaire to retrieve primary data, it's pretty much similar to what I mentioned before. So investors could be asked to declare their assets and then be graded on the percentage of assets that meet the gold standard for AMR responsible investment. And consistency could then be measured across these assets, including how the group policies are looked at. in different, how they're applied in different asset classes, and how these policies are then maintained by external managers or service providers. So I'll just go over the current findings that we've managed to gather generally. So if you look at investor groups to start off with, so there's these ratings called the ESG ratings, so the environmental, social, and governance ratings, and they're a pretty standard thing that investors will use to try to make sure that their investments are responsible on an environmental and social level. And they're not really too helpful for AMR policy. And this is because ESG itself is a very risk-oriented framework. And they tell people that they should protect their portfolio from risk, but this is not necessarily very helpful when it comes to addressing the systemic issue of AMR. And the way that investors will traditionally look at their entire portfolio is obviously look to maximize profit in each of their singular asset classes, but maximizing profit in singular companies might not maximize the overall performance of the entire portfolio, because the action of some companies might harm the performance of others. For an example, I guess you could have one asset class that is focused around fossil fuels and oil, and then you could have a different asset class such as perhaps like a farm. And then obviously the externalities from fossil fuel usage, such as things like smog or acid rain, will affect your asset class or your farm. So maximizing the profit of the fossil fuel industry will not maximize the profit of your other asset class. So that's just a demonstration of that principle. It is in general just a very passive framework. So this highlights the fact that we need to kind of revolutionize, in a sense, how investors will look at their asset classes and their investments. And there also just needs to be a collective effort to combat AMR on the investor level, perhaps through the introduction of guardrails, so kind of like a centralized set of standards for all investors to follow, because obviously if some investors will follow responsible consideration of antimicrobial usage, this might mean that in the short term they kind of fall behind in terms of their profits, and no investor wants to do that. So a concerted effort would be more conducive to maximizing profit in the long term. And COVID-19 could be a really good model for encouraging investor change, because obviously we've seen the massive economic impact of COVID-19, and it really kind of highlights and exemplifies this to investors to show that global health is really important externality that can kind of leak into their practices. So that would be good in terms of us demonstrating how important it is to focus on AMR. And just as a final note, the slide highlighting the risk of AMR to portfolios and encouraging the filing of stakeholder resolutions. So that's when individual stakeholders will go to the central board and kind of argue for changes. Looks to be the most promising way in which we can kind of try to implement what we have looked at here. And so if we look at restaurant and retailer groups, they tend to have some AMR policies in place, but they need to be encouraged to develop ways in order to assess whether these goals are being met. So we were looking at potentially encouraging to sign up to like an auditing and like an annual auditing process where their progress could be measured against their goals. So that's like a third party coming in and doing that. So that increases the objectivity of it, because I think sometimes with like restaurant groups, for example, such as like McDonald's, their AMR policy is pretty good, but the only problem is the fact that they keep extending the deadline in which to achieve those goals further and further and further, which means that essentially they don't actually do anything about it. They just extend the deadline. That's obviously not very good. You don't want AMR policies to just be there for sure. You actually want them to do something. So yeah, that's in respect to that point. And the second point is the fact that the government needs to work in partnership with these organizations to make implementation of individual policy easier. So that kind of alludes to what I was saying earlier about the kind of central organization, the guardrails that investors and investor groups should adopt. A similar framework should be adopted here. And restaurant groups and retailer groups are really in a prime position to be able to steer demand from producers, because obviously they're like the main groups that are going to buy produce. So they should kind of reciprocally demand better practice from producers, which we'll come on to in the next part. So producer groups, that's like agricultural groups, like farm groups. So appropriate usage of antimicrobials needs to really be defined in the sector, because we've talked about prophylactic usage, which is the use of antimicrobials to kind of prevent infection and growth promotion. But also, obviously, we can't have no antimicrobial usage in the sector at all. Like, there's animals who will get ill and who will need antimicrobials for other reasons. There needs to be a clear and a distinct definition as to what is appropriate and what is inappropriate, to be able to actually understand what constitutes as too much usage of antimicrobials. And in this sense, producers really need to work with vets to kind of reduce antimicrobial usage. And what we actually found looking at the literature is there is quite a tendency to oppose centralized data collection on antimicrobial usage in these groups, because obviously there is a bit of a stigma around excess antimicrobial usage. So anonymized data collection might be the way forward to kind of understand how much antimicrobials are used in the sector, and therefore to better understand how we can reduce it. So that's pretty much our findings as of yet. And just as a future or an additional goal, we would also like to conduct a systematic review of company data following the EU regulation ban of prophylactic use of antibiotics, which I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. So if possible, we'd like to focus on the results of the transition, the impact on animal health. And by the transition, I mean the transition from prophylactic usage to no prophylactic usage at all, and animal health and mortality, and also how much it has cost to do this transition, and how these protein producers have managed to adapt their business model and remain profitable. And the focus here will really be on how companies have made gradual changes to policy, because this could be really helpful in terms of encouraging the same legislative changes in the US and China and Brazil to hopefully make an even bigger impact. But yeah, that's pretty much it from me. So yeah, if you guys have any questions, feel free as well.
Does anyone have any questions for Angelica? I have one actually.
Do you?
It's about the point you mentioned about always extending deadlines.
Yeah.
And how companies have this sort of AMR policy for show, but
Yeah.
they don't actually end up implementing anything on it, or don't go as far as they say it. So what sort of steps do you think that people can take to sort of encourage them to not keep doing this, and what are the ways in which we can do that, do you think?
Yeah, so I think public boycotting, or even things such as petitions, or just a general public awareness, which is why things like this conference are really important, to try to push these not just the restaurant groups, but also retailers, producers, in the direction to be we don't want to buy things from you if you're going to use antimicrobials irresponsibly. I think what our group was also talking about was potentially introducing kind of little stickers on food products to indicate how much or to what extent antimicrobials have been used in the production of those goods, because we kind of already have a similar indication to things like carbon footprint, because we can kind of see how much carbon emissions have been used in making something like meat. And then people who are more conscious of these environmental factors can then steer away from purchasing these things, and therefore shape the market kind of from that end. So I think implementing similar things, but also petitioning and generally talking about AMR can help that. But yeah.
Sure, thank you.
Cool.
All right.
So
you have any more questions, feel free to ask. Good.
Yeah.
So our next student speaker for today is Edwin.